Hello, my name is Stephen Smith. I am the owner of Controllership Solutions, and you can read more about my style and services at quickencoach.com or sundialvfo.com. In this video series, I'm reviewing new Quicken features that have been added in 2022. This video will be dedicated exclusively to a new feature on restricted stock units, also known as RSUs. We're going to talk about RSUs. We're going to go into the product, walk through some of the new features, and talk about the pros and cons of what Quicken has done and just handling RSUs in general. Let's get started. Restricted stock unit feature was added in the August 2022 update. That's release 43.14. You can view all of these releases and all of these additions in the release notes, which can be found from the help menu. Specifically, it says added restricted stock unit tracking and investment accounts accessed from enter transactions. Now let's go to the product. So here we are, and now if we hit enter transactions, we're going to see some new items, RSU Grant and RSU Vest. So we are going to take advantage of the grant and the vest. But first, let's talk a little bit about RSUs. RSUs are typically a form of incentive compensation to retain and reward work. They're very popular with startups. They're very popular in Silicon Valley. And they are also popular with bigger companies that are looking to retain mid-level, senior level, and executives. The important concept to understand is the timing and what exactly an RSU is. So a stock RSU, it's almost always with stock, is worth nothing when it's awarded, also known as when it's issued. When it's issued, it's given to the employee and said, here, you are entitled to this many shares over what is usual a vesting period. When they're given to that employee, it's important to note they are worth nothing. It's just a promise to say, if you are still employed at such and such a day, and sometimes if a certain milestone is met, then you are entitled to a certain amount of shares. When you do hit those milestones, whether it be time or another type of milestone, you are granted those RSUs or vested. At that point, it's treated as a bonus or regular earned income. And with all earned income and with all bonuses, you have to pay taxes. So taxes are withheld. Sometimes that may include federal, state, and Medicare. And typically, these taxes are paid by selling a certain amount of shares. So if you were granted 100 shares and that stock at that point was worth $100, that would be worth $10,000, but you may not receive $10,000 in stock. Instead, you're probably going to only receive 60 shares worth $6,000 because you have to pay 40% or 40 shares or $4,000 in federal, state, and Medicare taxes. Now, after you receive those shares, they are regular shares just as you would own any other stock, and your basis in that stock is what you ultimately ended up paying the after-tax proceeds for those securities. So it's very important to understand exactly the timeline and what exactly an RSU is. Let's look at what a typical RSU stock looks like. This is an actual Notice of Restricted Stock Unit Award or Issuance and Restricted Stock Unit Agreement. And you'll notice that there is a grant number, a grant date, a vesting date, and a number of RSU shares granted. It also defines the vesting schedule. In this particular instance, they received 1/16 of the number of RSUs each quarter following the vesting date. So each quarter for every 3 months for 16 periods, which is 48, they would get another 16th of shares if they are still employed. And then there's many more pages of this agreement with lots more legalese, which is beyond the scope of this agreement. But the important part is to understand the typical terms of what that looks like. So let's go into the product. Let's go into Quicken, try to figure out and try to understand how we can best utilize this RSU feature. So the first thing I'm going to do is I want to create a separate account for RSU. So we're going to create an offline account. It's going to be a brokerage account. It's going to be a complete investing account. And we're just going to call it RSU account. And we are going to say next. And we will put the state in. We will not start off with any securities. And we are sure this is also not a single mutual fund account. So now that we have a new RSU account, let's go ahead and enter an RSU grant. So we're going to use the transaction command, RSU grant. And let's go back in time to January 1st, 2021. And let's use the security block, formerly known as square. And to keep things easy, we're going to say we have 1,000 shares. And we're going to say 1,000 RSUs issued. And now we have a choice between the vesting schedule. That vesting schedule that we were just looking at was we were given every quarter, which would be every 3 months. The vesting schedule that we just looked at was 1/16 or 0.0625% every 3 months. In our instance, and then it was fully vested after 48 months. In our simple example, let's say we get 10% every 3 months. Make it every 1 month. So we will be fully vested certainly after 12 months. Now, what's going to happen is when we hit enter, it's going to enter a whole series of transactions of what those RSUs will look like. There's another option that we have is to set the RSU valuation. This is a feature in Quicken, which I think is very clever. It basically assigns a value to the RSUs. Remember, RSUs are actually worth nothing when they are issued. So you have to either be employed or reach a milestone before you get the securities. So they may not be worth anything. If you quit or if you leave or if you're fired, you don't get anything. So there is a value assigned to that. So you don't want to make your net worth look much higher than it actually is. So you might want to say, you know what, I'm only going to recognize 50% of the value because there's a 50% chance that I'm still around when all of these things vest. And that's a little frustration there. We just lost our 10%. And now what we'll go is we'll go into January 1st, 2021 and every month. So now what we're going to do is we're going to hit enter and done. And as you can see in the register, so now we'll see that there's a bunch of things populated, RSU Vest and then removal. So each month we get another vest, and then it removes RSU securities and replaces them with actual vest securities. Now, one unexpected consequence was we start off with 1,000 shares, and I said the first one is going to vest 100 shares, and then 10% over 12 months. Well, it overrode the math. I was expecting to see 10 transactions of 100, and everything would be fully invested in 12 months, not 12 months. So what it did is it took 1,000 shares, vested 100, took the 900, divided over 12 months, and now there's 75, which is not exactly what I really intended to happen. So what I really intended to happen, and let's just do that again in a second RSU account, was I wanted grant, security name of block, and I wanted 1,000 shares, and I wanted the first vest of 10% on January 1st, 2021. Let's make sure we change this date. And then every 1 month with it full in 10 months. And now when I hit enter and done, hopefully we'll see 10 tranches of 100 shares over 10 months. And here we are, and we're still close, but not exactly what I was expecting. We are 90 shares, not 100 shares, and there are 11 of them, not 10 of them. So definitely requires some trial and error. But let's move on for academic purposes. And what are we exactly looking at? So in both instances, it valued it as $61,470. Let's see if we can understand how we got to $61,470. So if we go into holdings, we have 61,47,000 shares, $61,740. So what is 1,000 shares as of September 1st, 2022? Well, by this time, we should have been fully vested, so we'd have all 1,000 shares. Now, if we were back, say on May 21st of 2021, we're going to get something that looks differently. We'll see that we only have 460 shares of fully vested shares and 540 of outstanding RSUs. Also worthwhile noticing is the RSUs are 50% of the value of the full price of the stock. So 122 versus 244. So it would have been $122 because we set that preference at 50% of the value, whereas the full price is 244. Because as of May 21st, we did not know that we were going to vest fully in this 540 shares. So let's understand a little bit more about what's happening between the full price of the stock block and the RSU, which is we see here, block RSU. So in the beginning, on say February 21st, 2021, we will have 810 RSUs. So we just had very few RSUs because we only had 2 months worth of vesting. So what is happening each period? So we go from 1,000 RSUs, and then each time we vest, we're going to remove, and then we're going to increase the number of actual shares. Now, this is extremely simplistic, right? This is extremely simplistic. And there's a couple of faults with that. This is a good start on the RSU, but RSUs are a little bit more complicated, what we're doing here. First of all, I'm not a big fan of the removal feature. It just seems to go and say, poof, take away the RSU, take away the RSU. That's I'm not generally a fan of those, but that's fine. I can understand why it is that command, because that's the only one that's going to reduce the RSU, and because we want a quote unquote market value assigned to the RSUs, even though we haven't vested in any of those yet. But then there is the actual vesting of this, the RSU vest. So in this instance, if we do nothing, it just says, oh, RSU vest, and it becomes stock. Well, RSU vest is one of the commands right here, RSU vest. And if we go in through the command without doing this, we would say, we would pick the vesting schedule, so on January 1st. And then what we would have is we have a couple of options. We can either remove them, which means we're quitting and we're no longer going to get anything, or we can actually record the receipt of the shares. Now this is where it gets a little bit challenging, because recording the receipt means this is the shares that we're actually getting. So here is, in this particular example, it defaults to 100. So we receive 100 because that's what we were promised, 100 shares. And then we would hit enter and done, and poof, we would have, we would also want to put in a price per share at vesting, because this would record the basis. So maybe it was $110 at the time. And into the account, well, we would pick, it was into the RSU2 account. Excellent. So let's just take that very simple example and say, wonderful. Unfortunately, it's rarely that easy. And so now what we've just done is we've recorded income of $11,000. That's $100 shares times $110, and that's what we call other income. And then, of course, we turn around with that income, and we bought the securities at $110, and that is our basis. And it just says from the vesting RSUs. So this is very good, and it defaulted to the day that I am recording this video. In reality, we would probably need to backdate that. Okay, now let's do it the other way. Let's go to the third grant on March 1st, 2021. We will select the vest and we will hit record vesting, which is a shortcut to the same transaction command as we saw before. See, there it is, RSU Vest, and it's already selected the March 1st. Now, we are going to receive all 90 because that's probably the contract. If you received a different number, if the contract was changed or if there was some reason that you didn't get all 90, you could click this button and say, okay, I'm only going to get 70 or 60. But in this instance, let's assume the contract is being fulfilled as was issued. We're going to get 90, except we're now going to add the complication of taxes. Even if you get 90 shares, you don't get all 90 shares. You probably only get 60 because you have to pay taxes. So 30 of these 90 shares that you're issued are sold to pay the tax man. So what happens is that you put in the number of shares that are going for taxes, and then you end up with 60. And then it's going to ask you the price per share at vesting. So let's just keep it easy, and let's say it's $100 per share. So, and where'd those shares go? Well, again, to keep it easy, we will put it into the same account that we're dealing with, RSU2. In reality, it may go to a brokerage account that you're holding these funds in. You don't keep the shares that are vested in the same RSU account that we're using to track all of this information. And over here, it's basically going to say, oh, 30 shares, it's going to do some calculation, and then it's going to assign the value of the 30 times 100. So I'm anticipating $3,000 in tax, and then there's other income, and I'm anticipating 90 shares times 100, so $9,000 in other income. So let's go ahead and hit done and confirm if we see those entries as of March 1st, 2021. So as anticipated, here is our March 1st income for the 90 shares, 9,000. Here is the miscellaneous expense, 30 shares, 3,000. And then here is the actual purchase of these shares, the shares that you own at 6,000, which is your new basis. So all things are what were expected. Let's do one more thing. Let's go to the fourth vest, and this time let's pretend that we are going to quit. So if we hit remove, we can just say, or if we click this button, also remove all later vesting entries, what would happen is it would remove all of the other vests, and then we would no longer have any more vesting. So let's see how this looks. So we're going to click OK, and then it's going to think. And then notice it's removed all of the future vests. And what's happened is that it's removed all of these. Now, what I would like is if I do leave, I don't actually want to see these RSUs on my books for each month. So I would go in and I would just remove all of them in one entry and then delete these removals. So that's a little adjustment that I would make to the functionality that is here. So the next thing I want to talk about is what other adjustments you might need to make. We've gone through the functionality that Quicken is presenting, and it's very good. It's a good start. However, RSUs can be a little more complicated. For instance, miscellaneous income. I wouldn't call this miscellaneous income. I would actually go and create a secondary category that actually has RSU income so that I could see that. Same with expenses. Unfortunately, it's probably not one tax you're going to pay. It's probably going to be federal, state, and Medicare. What I used to do before all of this functionality, and I may still continue to do that with my clients who are using RSUs, is something a little more advanced. For instance, this is a actual release confirmation, and in here you can see that the shares awarded versus the shares sold for the stock and the shares issued. Now, here is the market value of those shares. This is the income. And then, of course, over here we have the taxes, federal income, state tax, and Medicare tax. So each of these different amounts. Then, if you notice down here, there is a rounding error of $78.57 because these were done in whole amounts. To make things even more complicated, there was a capital gain and sometimes there was a capital loss because the awarding of the shares took place in the morning at the beginning of the trading day, whereas the sale or the settlement took place in the afternoon. And because of that timing issue and because of the volatility of the stock, there was a slight gain on the sale to pay those taxes. So all things that kind of added to the complication. In Quicken, how did I treat that? Well, to account for the fact that I wanted to capture the income and I wanted to call it RSU and I wanted to capture the federal, state, and Medicare tax, I created a paycheck amount. And I actually created a paycheck and with the proceeds, transfer that into E-Trade, and with the cash proceeds and that random, I put that to a clearing account or a primary account. And those securities with that trade, with that money, I actually did a buy. So this is kind of the version of the ad that came from the automatic vesting. I just did it manually because I had to record that. And then I made very copious notes in all of the memos. See, here's the 43 minus the 29, and I always kept track of the grant number because the grants can be confusing. In the instances where I had that small realized gain, that small realized loss, I had to do miscellaneous expenses and track it that way, hitting miscellaneous expenses. So not a perfect world, so it's not always quite as simplistic as what we have here. So we just have to understand the big picture. I hope this was helpful. I do appreciate that Quicken has launched this feature, and I hope they approve upon it in the months and years to come. If you have any questions, I can always be contacted at quickencoach.com or sundialvfo.com. Thank you.